entering is my second half of Calumet Revisited, because she represents Calumet College, and we sat down together 4 years ago and decided on coming up with something like this. And so it ended up like this. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but that's how it is.
It's amazing to me how you come up with some interesting speakers all the time. I mean, really. Huh?
Sometimes you have,
That's gotta be difficult, because I'm
sometimes you
just
have
get
to.
speakers for an organization.
Actually, it is. The criteria for that is age. If you live long enough, you've met enough people. So you form a network of speakers.
And then once in a while, he gets really desperate and just finds whoever he can.
Anyway, I want to welcome you to another session of Calumet Revisited. And before I get into the introduction of the speaker, I want to mention an announcement. I have an announcement, at least one. And if anyone else has an announcement, looks like somebody does, just follow me. But this is, as you remember, in January of 2015, we had a session on a trailer for a documentary called Shifting Sands. And that was Lee Botts and Pat Wisniewski.
Went down to the field museum.
Yes, and then later on, they showed it at the Field Museum. But Calumet Revisited had the first. And then it was the Field Museum. But anyway, and that was their kind of their early trailers, and then they had several trailers after that. But anyway, for those that haven't seen Shifting Sands and have missed out on it, it's going to be here at Calumet College on a week from Thursday, February 15th at 7 p.m., 7 to 9 p.m. And there's going to be a panel discussion afterwards, and Ken Schoon, who should be here this evening, will be on that panel. So I just want to remind everybody of that. And are there other announcements?
Yeah, we're going to have 2 programs at Gibson Woods. The first one will be February 25th at 1 p.m. We're going to be showing Riding the Rails of History, the history of the South Shore Line. And producer Paul Nelson will be there to talk about the film, how he made it, and his resources. And then
That's a Sunday.
That's a Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock, yes. And then on April 7th, that's a Saturday at 1 p.m., we're going to be showing the Smithsonian film From the Ashes. And that really deals with the coal industry. But being here in the Calumet, we have a lot of parallels. So everyone is welcome to come to that also. Both are free. Just give us a call so we know how many to expect.
That's a really cute little nature center. Very nice. I like it.
Do you want to give the number?
The number is 219-844-3188. And Gibson Woods is located in Hammond, 6201 Parish.
It's out in the booty,
Yes, it is.
and real nice booties, by the way.
It's hidden away. You just have to kind of know where it is.
Exactly, and don't give up, because it's worth getting there. Anyway, I want to start this evening's program and introduce our speaker, Larry McClellan. He's returned, actually. I think he was here 2 or 3 years ago, Larry. And he's returned because he's much closer to his book than he was then.
Yes.
And each year he gets a little bit closer. But anyway, so it's coming up, I think, this summer.
We think, I'm working with editors now, and it's on the Underground Railroad in the whole Chicago region, and hopefully will be in print this summer.
So just to give you a little bit of background on him, after graduate work at the University of Chicago in 1970, Larry helped create Governor State University and served with the university for 30 years. For many years, he was university professor of sociology and community studies, and 6 years executive director the South Metropolitan Regional Leadership Center. And I think that's when I got to know him personally. In the mid-70s, he was mayor of University Park. After retiring from Governor State, he spent 4 years as a senior consultant with the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, which is now CMAP. And throughout his career, he also served as pastor with diverse congregations. He was selected by the Illinois Humanities Council for 2013-14 as an Illinois Road Scholar, lecturer on the history of Illinois highways. And I want to know, was that before or after you joined the bikers group on Route 60?
Actually, it was after I started doing the bikers, the Route 66 stuff.
Okay, so we have to talk more about that. That intrigues me. His consulting, research, and writing focus on historic highways, the Underground Railroad in Illinois, and African American and regional history south of Chicago. He is currently completing book manuscripts on To the River, The Remarkable Journey of Caroline Coral, Freedom Seeker from St. Louis. Another one, Freedom Seekers and the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois, and that's this summer.
Yeah.
And then also on the regional history south of Chicago. For 10 years, he wrote a monthly regional history column for the Southtown Star newspapers. And anyway, this is what he's done. He's done a little bit more, but that would probably take
Just
too long.
don't pray too much.
I mean, some of this stuff you won't believe. Anyway, Larry.
I've always kind of been intrigued by journey stories, and so I've ended up kind of with two research hats. One is actually looking at the history of historic roads, and the other has been looking at the journeys of freedom seekers and coming up in Illinois, and they're all kind of journey kinds of things. But the thing that Mike kind of pointed to, about 8 years ago, working on the historic highway stuff, I was researching who really looks at Route 66. I ended up getting in touch with a German tourist organization, and for the last 6 years, every summer we take 2 weeks with Harley Davidsons from Chicago to Santa Monica. And I drive the support van and kind of guard the back end of the Harley riders. We have riders from all over the world, and they love, it's a great way to see America. So the journeys are kind of interesting, but I'm not here to talk about roads. I should come back sometime and talk about historic highways, because it is kind of fascinating. Yeah, right. But that's the other thing. But I'm been looking at a lot of stuff in the kind of the Calumet region for a long time, and Mike and I have worked on a variety of things together, and it was really intriguing as I got into the Underground Railroad material to discover that we've got some real Underground Railroad stories right here. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of introduce you to what was this whole business about freedom seekers and Underground Railroad, and then kind of end up by focusing in on the Calumet stuff. So we're going to try and see if we can get at least some of the lights down. So. That's good. Oh, that's wonderful. Good. All right. Terrific. All righty. Well, to begin with, from the very beginning, slaves in the South, people that were caught in chattel slavery, were always trying to get free, and that has led a lot of us who we're dealing with to really be developing the language of freedom seekers. And it's very, I think it's a very powerful point to make at the very beginning. And that is that if you're talking about fugitive slaves, you end up talking, you're casting people in this kind of, if you will, a negative kind of language, an oppressive kind of language. And the reality is that these people, although they were fugitives from the law, what was motivating them was the fact that they were seeking their freedom. And of course, the great irony in American history is for these people to find their freedom, they had to leave the land of the free. And so coming through Illinois and Chicago and the Calumet Region was just kind of a way station on the way to Canada. Because if you were going to be a free human being, you had to be in Canada if you were black. And so that I want to begin by just emphasizing the importance of using this language of freedom seekers. And a remarkable collection of individuals who decided that for the sake of their families, their children, their own selves, they wanted to be free. And so they took off running for their lives. And as they started moving through places like Illinois, people started having these black people started showing up in their backyards, and they began to develop networks of response and support. And that's what we come to call the Underground Railroad. There were the networks that were responding to the movement of freedom seekers. Now, whenever we talk about this kind of material, it's always crucial to begin with never to forget the conditions of servitude. What was going on with slavery? It was an awful, awful human business. And I think it is, along with the extermination of Native people, one of the great stains on American history. And, people, hauled out, captured in Africa, and of course, ironically, most often by other Africans, and brought to the coast, sold to Europeans, taken across on these incredibly crowded slave ships. Something like, probably 12 to 14 million people were transported across the Atlantic into slavery in the Americas. And then this phenomenon of being treated as property. One of the things that's very sobering in my work is that when I'm doing research on freedom seekers, to look at them before the Civil War, I can't use census data. What I have to use are property records. And some of the most stunning things that I've discovered has been right there in the list, the lists of horses and the cattle and the sheep and the human beings called slaves. It's fairly, serious to remember that. People are property. They are not human beings, they are property. Slavery as it emerged in the United States, there was slavery across all of the colonies, but by the time of the Revolution, slavery in the North was starting to kind of waste away, and in fact, it was against the law in Massachusetts and other places. And so by 1850, it was very clear there were the slave states, and here identified in gray, and then the free states. And of course, California had just been admitted to the Union. Intriguing to note on the map that these are not the Civil War states, because remember that Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware did not join the Confederacy, although they had been slave states. Another thing that's intriguing about the map is to recognize the location of Cairo in southern Illinois, and you'll note that Cairo, and in fact, most of this, the extreme tip of Illinois, is further south than most of Virginia. And the unique thing that we had in Illinois was that we had this kind of like this wedge into the south. And we had literally hundreds of miles of border with slave states. And so it ain't no surprise that there were a number of slaves that looked across the rivers at Illinois, and as they made the decision to become freedom seekers, they decided to take off for Illinois. Now, to this 1850 map, I've added the blue lines just to give you a representational sense of where people traveled from. Coming out of all parts of the South, basically going north, wanting to get to Canada. And also there were folks that escaped into the Caribbean, into Mexico, and into the West to live with Native peoples. We have in northern Illinois, we have a couple really intriguing stories of freedom seekers that came and actually lived with Native peoples before the area was settled by Anglo settlers. And of course, there was movement up the Mississippi River Valley into and through Illinois. Okay? Of course, the Underground Railroad wasn't really a railroad, and it wasn't really underground. But this is a very famous cartoon image from, come on in, find a seat.
Thank you.
Actually, do we have a seat? Well,
Yeah.
we'll find a place. So it wasn't really a railroad, it wasn't really underground. But but this wonderful kind of iconic image of the train, the train going underground. The best image or idea we have where the term came from was an incident where slave catchers in Kentucky were chasing freedom seekers. They got across the Ohio River, and the Kentucky slavers chased them and got there, and they were just stone gone. And the story is that one of the slave catchers looked at the other and says, well, you know, they probably got away on some kind of underground road because we can't see them hide their hair then. And that notion of there being some mysterious underground road evolved into an underground railroad. And by about 1840, this notion of there being this underground railroad got to be very compelling. But of course, it was not underground and it was never a railroad. Think about it, today, a lot of our language of talking about human behavior and the operation of our brains and all, we use computer language. Because that is, if you will, that is the kind of the exciting technology language of today is computer-based language. And so we talk about our brains as wired, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the 1830s, the great technology of the day were the railroads. So it is no accident that people would use that new jazzy technology to talk about this basic human experience. It's an interesting cartoon, and one of the things that's nice about it is, I could spend an hour just talking about this. But one of the things that's nice about it is that in addition to talking about the Underground Railroad getting fugitives to freedom, it also says here at a note at the bottom, for the special benefit of pro-slavery police officers, an extra heavy wagon is available, bound for Texas, and they will carry those police slave catchers as dead freight to the Valley of Rascals. It's kind of a nice point. But anyways, the notion being that by the early 1840s, people really were seeing that there was this growing operation of people that were very interested in assisting freedom seekers. And of course, the movement was getting out of the slave states. And so we've got movement out of Kentucky going north, movement out of Missouri coming to the east. And most of the freedom seekers that came through our region had come up the Mississippi River Valley, most out of Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, then up the Illinois River Valley into the Chicago region. And of course, the issue was always trying to get to Detroit, because that's where you could be free. During this period, from the 1820s into the time of the Civil War, my research suggests that somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 freedom seekers successfully moved through the state of Illinois, including roughly 3,600 to 4,500 that came through the Chicago-Calumet region. And I think that's a pretty solid number. The national estimates these days are that somewhere around 40 to 45,000 freedom seekers made it to Canada. And so the activity in Illinois is about 10% of the activity across the United States. Ironically, in the sense, until my book comes out, there really is very little talk about Illinois in the national discussion of the Underground Railroad because the research has never been published. So I'm very excited I'm going to be adding to that conversation. Along the Mississippi and Illinois, there were a number of key places like Cairo and Arthur and Quincy and others and Alton, that communities that ended up having a lot of people, freedom seekers, moving through them. As I said at the very beginning, these are journey stories. And what I've got up here are just a couple very suggestive stories. A remarkable young woman named Carolyn Quarles, who decided to go for her freedom in 1843. And I've written a book about Caroline. And she traveled up the Mississippi got to Galena. There was one black guy living in Galena. And Caroline was this beautiful 16-year-old, long black hair, freckles, blue eyes. And she was passing. And as she traveled up the Mississippi, she was passing as a white person. She got to Galena, and there's one black guy lives in Galena and says, "You're passing. Watch out, slave catchers are going to get you." And so he hustled her out of town. She ended up going on stagecoaches to Milwaukee. She was the first freedom seeker that people saw in Wisconsin. And they weren't sure what to do. But interestingly, they knew in Milwaukee in 1843 that the best Underground Railroad network to assist freedom seekers was in Will County and the Calumet region. And so Caroline was set down with the escort, and she came down around Chicago and spent a couple days in Crete, which is just, 10, 15 miles south of here, and then went on over into to Freedom in Canada. That's the black line. And then some of these others are just, I've got, at this point, about now close to 200 stories of individuals that have come through the Chicago region. And just all kinds of remarkable journeys. This was a couple that were living on adjacent farms in western Tennessee. Their name was John Little, and he married a woman named Eliza. They got married in 1841. They traveled up through western Illinois up to Chicago, and then they went on to live very successful up in Canada. And recognize that here at Detroit, all you had to do was get a rowboat to get to freedom. And so people were really, really anxious to get there. A couple again, I've got a story for each of these people, but a couple really interesting people that begin to touch on our experience here. This is a very famous picture from the 1890s of freedom seekers living in Windsor, Canada, just across from Detroit. And two of them have a direct connection to the Calumet. Henry Stevenson over here escaped out of Missouri and traveled up the Iron Canal, got to Chicago, and then went from Chicago to Michigan City. There were little coastal lake steamers that went from Chicago, and they just stopped at various places along the way to get on the way to Michigan City. And so Henry Stevenson would have stopped somewhere right up here on Lake Michigan on his way from Chicago to Michigan City, then on to Detroit. Lucinda Seymour was also escaped from Missouri, and she traveled right through, and I'll show you where she traveled. She came right through the Calumet region. Recognize that things evolved in Illinois. In the early days, freedom seekers were basically moving on their own, and we've got indications from the 1820s, very, very clear indicators of people moving into our region, basically doing it totally independently. Starting in the late 1830s, the networks we call the Underground Railroad begin to emerge. And then after 1845, particularly in Chicago, but also across the state of Illinois, there is significant African-American leadership providing assistance to freedom seekers. And then after 1855, a lot of it shifts onto the railroads. One of the great images that we all struggle with is that due to the kind of, I'll call it a kind of quiet racism of the 1870s and 80s, there developed an image of the Underground Railroad of these heroic white conductors who were saving the bewildered, ragged slaves. And that just isn't true. And for one thing, we're not talking about bewildered, ragged slaves. We're talking about people, families, and individuals who were very, very deliberate about going for their freedom. They were the agents in charge of their own lives. And then, in addition, there were a wide range of whites that were providing support, but also across the state of Illinois and in Chicago, there was dramatic support being provided by other people of color. And that's part of the story that we need to need to change. The entire Chicago story is white-based, and that's simply inaccurate. And hopefully, we're in the process of turning that around. Now, in my research over the last 15 years, I've identified well over 40 places in our metro area where I know that we had freedom seekers stopping and where there were people providing direct assistance. So it was a very broad set of activities. These people, the whites all knew each other and worked well together through anti-slavery organizations. They were abolitionists, but then there were probably 90% of the abolitionists in Illinois did not help freedom seekers. But there was a small group of radicals that did assist them. After the mid-1840s, there were black activists in Chicago, Joliet, and other communities down in the south of the state, and these whites and blacks knew each other and collaborated together. And part of the reason this story is so important is because this is really the first significant biracial social movement in America. That in the 40s and 50s, 1840s and 1850s, well into the Civil War, there were white people and black people working very closely together. And we've got interesting stories of people that ended up developing lifelong friendships in a time when there was a tremendous amount of antagonism directed against people of color. There were, in fact, real deep biracial friendships that have been developing across the world. Now, some of the places to just kind of tickle your fancy and interest, and I'd love to have you go out into Illinois and kind of wander around and look at some of these places. In DuPage County, in Lombard, the home of Sheldon and Harriet Peck, the Sheldon Peck Homestead, were very active in the DuPage region in assisting freedom seekers. In Maywood, in western Cook County, there was a thing called the 10 Mile House. And guess what? It was 10 miles from Chicago. And it was on the road from Galena and the Northwest going into Chicago. And we've got some very interesting stories about freedom seekers being helped at the 10 Mile House. Well, 10 Mile House burned down years and years ago, and it happened on that property that a McDonald's was built. And somebody in Maywood had the insight to talk to McDonald's people, and they established an Underground Railroad memorial at the McDonald's. And the classic, there are a handful of these around the country, with the tracks going down into the ground, and that is the, and there's some interesting signage here, and also there are some other interesting things like the shackles. But that is, again, that was on that main road coming into Chicago, and we know that freedom seekers moved along that. Up in the northern suburbs, there's a tavern called the Mother Rudd House, right on the Des Plaines River, where we know that freedom seekers were assisted. Out in Ottawa, Illinois, and LaSalle, the John Hassop family were very involved. And again, each of these things I'm pointing to, we've got kind of cycles of stories that connect all these. In the city itself, there was a whole crew. There were about a dozen deeply involved black activists and about a dozen deeply involved white activists, and these people all knew each other. Some of you may know a bit about John and Mary Jones. They were really the leaders of the black community in Chicago for many, many years, and John was the first black elected to an office in Cook County. They were very dear friends and worked closely with the Atkinsons and other folks through two congregations. There was an AME church and a Baptist church where they were very active in assisting freedom seekers. Also some interesting people like Dr. Charles Dyer, who's Philo Carpenter, of course Alan Pinkerton, the guy who becomes starts the detective stuff. They were all up to their ears in assisting freedom seekers. And again, we're talking about over 30 years. We're talking about somewhere around 3,000 people coming through Chicago itself. Looking now at the kind of southern part of the region, each one of the little houses represents a site that I'm very confident that we have had experience. And if you will notice, there's a couple kind of patterns. Notice there's a kind of a pattern going across here. This is the Sauk Trail corridor. The Sauk Trail was the great native trail from the Mississippi going to Detroit. Hundreds of miles, and it comes through, one branch of it comes through Dyer and then up through LaPorte and Valpo and then on up toward Detroit. So there is this corridor of movement going east-west, and then there was this corridor going north-south where people were assisting, and then there was movement coming to the east. And we'll look at that a little more closely in a second. Getting closer to home, but not quite to the Calumet, if we go south of here about, well, what is it, 10 miles? 15 miles? Something, anyways. It's down there. If you go to Crown Point, from here you go due south to Crown Point, and then go west, you're in Crete. There was a cluster of abolitionist families in Crete, and I'm now working very closely with local history people there. We're developing a Crete Freedom Trail because we've got a whole cycle of remarkable stories, and a lot of the people that came into the Calumet area had come from the folks in Crete. What we've been able to identify is a set of families and farms, and this is that's the Cook County line, so it's just into Will County. And the Sauk Trail came from Joliet over here on its way to Dyer, over this way. And then the post road from Joliet came down and ended up in Crown Point. It's over there. And what we have in Crete is a collection of families, all of whom we know were directly involved with freedom seekers. The church they founded together was located here in the middle of Crete, but there's a set of farms both north and south of the village that were directly the environment for freedom seekers. There is, in a tantalizing story, there is one farmhouse still standing. This thing back here. This was built in 1856, and it was owned by an abolitionist family, and we think that it's possible that there would have been freedom seekers in this house, but it's the only old building that we have left in the Crete area. Also in Will County, over next to Joliet and Lockport, this is the I&M Canal building, built in 1837. One of the most important old historic structures in northern Illinois, and we know clearly that there was a significant number of freedom seekers that came up on the I&M Canal, and also in one way or another passed through Lockport. Also in Will County is the town of Wilmington and New Lenox. And again, we have whole cycles of stories of freedom seekers coming up the Illinois River Valley, and then coming across into our direction. Other kinds of folks involved in Joliet, in Homer Township, Mokina. So there's a very strong set of activities in Will County. Now, let's come back to the regional thing. And again, what's important for our stories and for what happened in the Calumet is the pattern of the early trails. And first of all, of course, is the Sauk Trail, that great east-west corridor. And then coming out of the south into the Chicago region was Vincennes Trace, Hubbard's Trail. It becomes Dixie Highway and Illinois State Route 1. And that represents that we have folks that are coming out of the south, overland, walking up into this area. And again, the folks, now Crete is right here. People traveled up this way, but they also traveled up on wagon roads and came straight north. And all of a sudden, here we are, right at our home territory now. Particularly important for what happened with freedom seekers in the Calumet region are the Chicago to Detroit roads. And in the 1820s, 1830s, the major thoroughfare was along, and many of you know this better than I, was traveling along the beach. And in 1837, families located living here next to the Little Calumet River established a ferry. It later became a toll bridge, and in 1856 became a free bridge. But when that was established in 1837, essentially the east-west traffic from Chicago to Detroit and back shifted from the beaches, because depending on the weather, that could be, you could do this in Michigan City in 6 hours if conditions were perfect. If conditions were not perfect, it took 6 days. So it was very, very iffy. And so the traffic was shifted internally and this onto this road. And this then becomes extraordinarily important in terms of the movement of all kinds of people, but also the movement of freedom seekers. To focus a bit more, some of you may know this map of the Calumet region. And originally, the Calumet River, under assorted names, flowed west into Illinois and then flowed back out and emptied into Lake Michigan at about Miller Beach. And then in the early 1800s, sometime between 1804 and 1820, this really gets closed out and really a new exit develops for the Calumet River coming out here. And this may have developed because of the activity of native peoples or the activity of these settlers. But it does change the dynamic. This is a map. The background map is it's a map of conditions in Illinois in 1804, and the location of native settlements here near Thornton and up here along the Little Calumet. Again, here's the Little Calumet turning and going around here. The Michigan City Road coming up across here, and this is the area that I've become very, very interested in. The location of the Ton Farm and the Dalton Ferry. The Dalton Ferry and Bridges. A fellow named George Dalton settled there in the mid-1830s and was responsible for the ferry and the bridge, and then the shift of all the traffic onto this road. This is a map from 1851, and again, you can see the location, and it is D-O-L. On the map, they have it misspelled. But so the Chicago-Detroit Road, the Michigan City Road, travels down, crosses the Little Calumet at this point, and there were 3 early Anglo families that settled at this point. The Dalton family, the Alsthold family, and a family named Matthews. The Matthews lived right over here. And I'm very confident that these early Anglo families, because of their activity with the ferry and with the bridge, any freedom seekers that were in Chicago and that were heading for Detroit would have come over their bridge. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume that they would have had direct contact and probably would have ended up having points when they were providing direct assistance to freedom seekers that were coming through the area. Then, in the late 1840s, a large number of Dutch families settled in the area that we now know as Roseland and South Holland. And those included a fellow named Jan Ton. He came by ship from Holland in 1848 with a fellow named Cornelius Kuiper and a woman named Angie Van Zandt. And he ended up marrying Angie, and in 1853, they bought some land from Dalton, and they settled and built a farm right here on the north branch of the Calumet. And we've got a very good cycle of stories about the engagement of the Tons in all of this, in dealing with freedom seekers. Here's another map, but again, you can see here's the mention of the Dalton family and the Tons down here. We've got very, very good documentation on their involvement. So what we have right here on in the midst of the Calumet region are these Anglo-American settlers that come in the 1830s, and then the Dutch that arrive in 1848, and they have connections both going directly up into Chicago, coming back and forth to Chicago. We've got stories of farmers in Crete bringing freedom seekers by wagon up through the Calumet on their way to Chicago. We know they would have gone across that bridge. And the old, on the maps, you can see the old wagon roads. Then in 1853, the Tuns move out on the north bank of the river, and it appears that these Dutch families were part of the reason they had come to America. The large part of the reason was to escape both political and religious persecution. There were a series of revolutions going on in Europe, and they were really looking for a place to be free. And so they would have been very predisposed to be friendly to fugitives that were coming through their region. And also, Jan Tan and Cornelius Kuiper both spoke English. And my colleague Paul Petraeus has discovered this, and we're really confident part of the reason they were involved was that they could talk not only to their Dutch friends, but they could also talk with the Daltons and the Allstalts and others, and could communicate with freedom seekers. These Dutch fellows, Cornelius and Jan Tan, and that's a picture of Jan and his wife Angie when they were significantly younger. Cornelius Kuiper built a house on Chicago Road. This is the Tun farm. You can see it's right on the little Calumet. He's there right on the edge. Here's another looking at it from the riverside. And again, that is, I guess from here, you go west across Wolf Lake and keep on going, and you'd end up with the current site of the Tun farm. Kind of an amazing story as we were researching and putting together all this research. A young fellow named Lerone Branch, who was an Eagle Scout, found out about this and wanted to do an Eagle Scout project to honor the Underground Railroad. And so I worked with Lerone and his family, and a bunch of other people were involved. And one of the things I suggested to Lerone was, if you want to do an Underground Memorial, why don't you go visit Maywood? And so they went up to Maywood, remember the tracks? And they came back and said, that's what we want to do. And so Lerone, with the help of a whole bunch of people, organizes and put it together. And this now memorial exists at the First Reformed Church in South Holland, and is memorial specifically to the Tun farm. And some of you may be able to read that, but Jan and Angie Tun Memorial Garden. This site is dedicated to the Tuns, and we settled on the farm 2 miles north of this site on the Little Calumet River. And so it's honoring their activity, and I think it's really kind of a remarkable story that Lerone and a collection of African American families worked with a collection of Dutch heritage families at the First Reformed Church and put together a memorial garden. The South Holland Garden Club maintains the flowers. They selected a bunch of things that are around in the whole area that are kind of indigenous to Illinois. And so we have in the middle of South Holland, which today is a multiracial community, a memorial created by blacks and whites, working together to figure out how do we remember these kind of remarkable stories of the Underground Railroad. So again, just to summarize, recognize that throughout the western part of the Calumet region, there was involvement with the Underground Railroad throughout its history, starting as early as the 1830s and 40s. And these would have been assisting freedom seekers that were moving east from Chicago, coming from Chicago down into the Calumet and going east. But also we know that a significant number had come up from Will County, traveling on wagon roads coming up through Calumet and across the Dalton Bridge. Just to focus again on our location, we are sitting over here someplace. Here's the state line, and the little Cal comes around like this. The Tun farm is up here. This is Indiana Avenue Bridge. The Illinois Central line comes right through here. The Indiana Avenue Bridge. The Tun farm is there. The memorial is down there. The Kuiper house was up here, and what becomes part of Roseland. So We've got a lot of activity here, and there are a bunch of stories. I'd love to have us have a few minutes to talk about this, but I do have one final thing to share with you that I'm very excited about. I was contacted a couple weeks ago by folks that are involved with community development stuff around the Tongue Farm, which of course is the very southern edge of the city of Chicago. So last week, we had a meeting with 25 people from all kinds of different organizations. People representing neighborhood organizations in Oak Hill Gardens and the Golden Gate neighborhood, along with some fire department people and forest reserve people and all that. We had a meeting at Carver High School. And there is a very serious inquiry into developing a Little Calumet Freedom Trail, really focusing on this set of activities. And we're very intrigued by the possibilities. One of the things they're talking about is, and some of you may know this, you kind of wander around, you can get Balbian Woods. Well, there is a boat launch. You can kind of get yourself down into Balbian Woods, which is part of the Forest Reserve. And there's this boat launch. And the boat launch, you can walk out on this deck next to the boat launch, and you can see 100 yards away the site of the Tongue Farm. And so part of the thing we're playing with is looking at the ways of perhaps creating some kind of an Underground Railroad interpretive site right here in Balbian Woods. And when I started talking with the Forest Reserve people, I said, well, remember, down here in Crete, which is down here, in this forest preserve are the home sites of several of the families that were involved in the Crete Freedom Trail also. So I'm looking at the potential of something that could be a very, very interesting story right here in the Calumet. So, okay, questions? Yeah.
Would you tell us just one interesting, unusual, tragic, inspiring story?
Sure. Cornelius Kuiper was, for a number of years, in many ways, Kuiper is kind of the lead, one of the leading citizens of the Dutch community in what becomes Roseland. And Kuiper was also, because of his kind of status in their community, he was the local constable. And his daughters wrote about how he used to, after the Civil War, he used to talk about how he took his being the constable very seriously. And of course, the fugitive slave law said public officials and sheriffs and police people are mandated by federal law to assist slave catchers. And so he used to delight in telling people about the times the slave catchers would visit him, and he would spend a whole afternoon rolling around and investigating barns and looking at all kinds of places where we knew there's got to be fugitives in someplace. And of course, they never found them. And he'd have the people back to his house for dinner, and he was being Mr. Support as the local constable. All the while, the freedom seekers were hidden in his basement. And he delighted telling people about this.
If anybody's interested, they could leave that
Oh,
with you.
great! Yes, great. Thank you. This is information about the committee, and yeah, you want to say another word about the committee?
Well, you said it about the monument. There was an effort afoot to have a monument built at Balbian Woods, which is just a couple of hundred yards away from where the Tongue Farm was located.
And if you want to be in that loop, fill one of these out, and Tom and I will see that you get it.
Right. I'm going to have to leave, but if they leave it with you,
leave it with you, then I'll
see
pass
you
it on
on
here.
Thursday,
So
yeah.
if you want to know about this monument thing that we're doing, yeah. Great, good.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Henry Stevenson, I showed you a picture of Henry Stevenson that came up on the I-9 Canal. Henry was enslaved on a farm in western Missouri. And at the neighboring farm, a couple, a man and a woman, escaped. And Henry knew them. And the owner of the was going after them. And so he went to Henry's owner and said, "Can I take Henry with me because he's a really clever guy and he can help me look for this couple?" And his owner said, "Sure." And so they got out and they traveled by horseback to St. Louis. They took a ferry or a steamer over to Alton, and then they took a riverboat up the Illinois River. And every place they stopped, the white guys, the slave catchers, they'd get out and they'd go looking, and they had handbills about this couple that escaped. And Henry's job was he would go visit any blacks that lived in that area. So in St. Louis, he went into the black neighborhood, and in Alton, he talked to some blacks, and going up the river, Peoria, every place. And he always told them, "Man, you can't talk to black people. Let me do it." And so Henry would do this. Then he'd report back, "No, nothing like that." And then they got up into, they got through LaSalle, and they went on the Iron Canal. And they were going along, and every time they stopped, Henry would go off, see the black people. "Have you seen this couple?" And the whites were looking too. And every time the boat stopped, the workers, particularly these Irish canal workers, would say, "Man, you're crazy, you can escape now, you're in the north, people will help you." And Henry said, no, "I'm working for my boss, working, gotta do this." And so, every time the canal boat stopped, people would tell him, "You should run away." He said, no, I got work to do." And they get up to Chicago, and Henry says to his friends, or no, he says to the bosses, he says, "Okay, now there's a big black community in Chicago, and you can't manage it. You got to let me go look around." And so Henry leaves his owners, leaves the guys, and he goes in, runs into some blacks and says, "Where do I find the abolitionists?" And so he gets to the white abolitionists, and with Henry, that's who he ended up getting to, was a couple white abolitionists, and they said, "Well, what we can do is we can get you to Canada." And Henry said, "Okay," but he said, "I don't have any money." He said, "Well, we can get somebody." He says, "I'll get some money." So he goes back to the slave owners, and he says, "I think I know what to do, but I need a little bit of cash. I gotta pay some people." So they give him a couple dollars. And of course, in 1848, a couple dollars is a lot of money. They give him a couple dollars, and he says, "Okay, I'll see you tonight and tell you where they are." And of course, what he does is he then goes to back to the white abolitionists. "Well, I've got some money to help pay for things." I said, "Fine." There was a coastal steamer called the Sam Ward that came out of Chicago, and it would go from Chicago, and it'd stop at, I don't know, the places it stopped on its way to Michigan City. And so they bought a ticket for Henry on the Sam Ward, and he left Chicago, and nobody ever caught him. And he ended up in Canada, and then they had a very good life in Canada. He lived into his 90s in Canada. So the thing that is remarkable is that we have these stories, and that part of the dilemma we have in American history, particularly in Illinois, is that we talk about the Underground Railroad, people want to talk about Harriet Tubman. And God bless Harriet Tubman. But that was in Maryland and New York and all of that. We have these remarkable people that came right through our part of the world, and we should be telling their stories. There is a woman named Belinda Fountain, who was a maid working for a Southern family, and they took a ride up the Mississippi River by riverboat, and they got to Galena. And Belinda, she told, when she got to Canada, she said, "We got there, and I had decided I had taken care of their children all their life, and it was about time for them to take care of their own children." And so she stole some of her master's clothing and got a hat, a heavy scarf, and just walked off the river. And as soon as she got into Galena, she found some people. They got her to Chicago. Probably, I haven't researched this yet, but it's possible Belinda may have come down across the Dalton Bridge right through here. But anyways, Belinda gets to Chicago, or gets to Canada, and the newspaper reports on her as disguised, escaping, dressed in men's clothing. And it says at the end of the article, and Miss Fountain would like her owner to know that, thank you very much, she was no longer interested in working for him. And well, yeah, good for her. So, wonderful cycles of stories. Anything else? Yeah.
Okay, today if you want to get anywhere, you go to Google and boom, you're there. How did word spread?
Okay, take that, see if there's.
Or how
Excuse me, just a second. Did you get my 9:15?
Oh, good.
Okay, should we do that? Okay,
Beautiful.
good. Yeah, I'm sorry, ask again.
how did word spread then? I mean, how did people know about what would be the safe routes or anything? Because they all seem to be going in the same direction. You don't see people coming back.
Yeah, it's a very, very good and very, very complicated question. It appears that the communications in many parts of the South, the communications among people held in slavery was fairly remarkable. That there were people that were passing between plantations, between farms, people that were, somebody, for example, who had blacksmithing skills, and he'd be going from this farm to this farm to this farm. There was evidently lots of movement, and with that movement, lots of communication. We know that there was very widespread perception that if you get north, you can be safe. And that it was not, sometimes that was as much as they knew. They just, if you get north, that you're going to find safety, you're going to find people that can help you. But we have instances of people in the 1820s being captured, freedom seekers that had tried to escape, being captured and being found with maps to Detroit in their pocket. And this is really a very new part of our research, but it looks like there was fairly widespread kind of person-to-person communication passed throughout slave environments in the South and among the farms in places like Kentucky and Tennessee. A second piece of that puzzle is that we now have found some interesting evidence that travel, movement, and activity in the Mississippi River Valley was extremely fluid. It included large numbers of free black people, large numbers of black slaves, many of whom were working independently. Like, I've got a couple great stories of black slaves who were owned by men in New Orleans. But basically we're told to just travel up and down the river and make money and send me a check. Send me some money every month. And they did that. And so in a sense, they're operating as free people, but they're slaves. Then they're free people. And all of these people are then ending up communicating with each other. And so we think that the communication was fairly widespread on that person-to-person basis. There is some provocative information suggesting that there were, in a few instances, radicals from the north, both whites and people of color, that went south with the intention of spreading information. And that's shaky, but that's really worth exploring how deep that was. But and please, in terms of the communications, all of that is understandable, but please beware of people talking about the quilts. And you may know the quilt story, and the story goes that part of the communication system was that there was this remarkable set of symbols that were incorporated into quilts, and they were hung out on the line, and that these gave messages to fugitives on how to get to freedom. That's not true. The quilt stuff is not true. And if anybody says to you, we understand that they used quilts to help the slaves in the Underground Railroad, tell them it is not true. Please go to the internet. There are a number of very strong websites. It has been absolutely demonstrated that this is a great false perception And probably the biggest issue that we all deal with as those that are in it is that people always want to talk about the quilts. I'm grateful none of you asked about that.
What about the same thing, the stories about the secret codes and songs like follow the drinking gourd zone? Is that the same?
It's the same thing. It's just not true. When you think about it, there are a couple, and for one thing, there are some people that start talking about the slave songs, and they weren't written until after the Civil War. Well, that's a problem. But there are some, there are a couple of the songs that were slave songs and that have Underground Railroad, what I would call Underground Railroad kind of resonance. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's got to trouble the waters. Well, yeah, if you're going to go north, you got to go in the rivers. Now, is that a secret sign or symbol? No, but it's a resonance. It is and there are things like that, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is a-coming for the carry, and it's not sure whether the drinking gourd was actually a slave song or not. But, again, yeah, follow the North Star.
Right.
Follow the drinking gourd. That makes sense. Was that some kind of elaborate coded thing? Well, no, it didn't have to be.
Yeah.
In this whole business, and a very widespread perception. How do you go north? Well, follow the North Star. How do you follow the drinking gourd? I mean, that kind of stuff. So some of the things that people want to turn into romanticized, secretive things are just kind of course that made sense. One interesting little wrinkle that of geography, if any of your geographers, you might enjoy this. Both the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, you may not know this, both of them flow north. They come out of the Appalachians and they go west and then they go north to the Ohio River. So, for freedom seekers, going downriver means going up north. And they were very powerful. I've got some wonderful stories, again, of people that traveled down the river, but it was going north. And most of us think, well, if we're going downriver, of course it's south. But there's about 200 miles of the Cumberland and the Tennessee that actually go north, which is kind of cool.
Could it have been likely that some of the songs may not have been written down until after the Civil War, but there was a strong oral tradition among the blacks and others that passed them along.
Yeah, I think I'm very open to that. I think the thing and were there resonances in the song or references? Makes a lot of sense that there would be that, but that's very different than, listen carefully, I'm going to give you a code. I mean, there weren't the kind of code, they didn't have to be the code things, because, people were very capable of talking to each other and saying, look, here's the thing to do. But in the song, did some of the songs that reflect some of that? Sure. And I'm sure there's more stuff that we're going to find. One of the things that's really fun with all this is that we keep finding new stuff, which is really cool. Except with the quilts, that's not new stuff. Yeah.
So I was wondering when you mentioned the road from Chicago to Michigan City.
Yeah.
What was the importance of Michigan City as it related to Detroit and how they traveled that way?
Okay, from the Michigan City has a lot of that area. If you think about kind of the, you're starting up on the eastern side of Lake Michigan, and that area right there at the bottom on the eastern side of Lake Michigan was very important in terms of the early settlement and trading patterns. And if you were going to travel from Detroit to Chicago, and Chicago in the early 1830s becomes more and more important. If you could, from Detroit, you could go straight west to the area of Michigan City, and fairly early in the mid-30s, they start developing these small boats that travel around the bottom of Lake Michigan, to get to Chicago. So you could travel by stagecoach to Michigan City and then there. In 18, and somebody help me on this, 1851, 1852, the railroad gets extended from Detroit to Michigan City. And then really, soon, then you get on the little steamer and you get to Chicago. And of course, that becomes very powerful in the reverse direction, because we have a number of stories of freedom seekers getting to Chicago and either coming overland or coming by lake steamer to Michigan City to get the train. And then, of course, by like 1854, the train gets extended into the Chicago area. But again, it comes right, through that. Is that go ahead?
Well, the other thing I was wondering is, was the Sauk Trail through there? Because you mentioned it went to LaPorte, and I thought it went through Michigan City, but I wasn't sure.
No, you see, again, remember when I talked about, I said, remember it's a corridor idea. The Sauk Trail itself goes LaPorte, Valpo, and then up into southwest Michigan. However, depending on weather, time of year, and that kind of stuff, it would have been relatively easy to go somewhat north of the Sauk Trail up into Michigan City and head, so it's all, if there is this kind of Sauk Trail corridor that goes from the Mississippi, following the north of the Illinois River from Joliet, and then it kind of sweeps up into Michigan.
What today is Route 12, going
Exactly.
up from Michigan City through Buffalo to Detroit, is a long historical.
That's right, and once you get into Michigan, that chunk of Route 12 is actually the Sauk Trail. It joins up, and the Dunes Highway that came along across the dunes, which becomes 12, the Dunes Highway then meets, if we had a blackboard, I could chalkboard, I could, but those are very, very historic patterns. But my point always is, think of it as a corridor. I mean, there are times when the weather would say, stay on the Sauk Trail, other times it would say, no, go further out. Yeah.
Going far west in, against the Mississippi, my wife's great-grandfather came from the Morrison, Fulton area. And the farm next to theirs, we visited, and they showed us their slave stick with like 23 notches on it. And it's at the western terminus of Route 30 before you cross the river into Iowa.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, wow, are those people still there?
Yes, they are. Mr. and Mrs. Abbott, it was his parents that did this. And he's gotta be 90 years old right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Could you write down something? Do you think, is there any way I could be in touch with them?
Probably. Actually, there's a book out, The House by the Road, I believe is the name of it. And it's her house on Route 30 that they're talking about some of this.
Oh,
The
I
house
know
by the
that.
side of the road.
I know that book. I think I may even have that book.
I have it at home.
Oh, wow. Could you,
I
can I give you my
pictures-
card? Later?
Yes,
Would you
I
take my
have some
card?
plans of survey, I have pictures of the barn
Yeah.
that they were in, I got the pictures of the slave stick.
Oh, wow. Please talk. The dilemma I have is that I decided I've been at this for 15 years, and I realize I have to limit myself to northeastern Illinois. So the furthest west I go is LaSalle County, with, Ottawa, LaSalle, that area.
This
And-
is Whiteside County.
I know, Whiteside, that's further west, but I'm trying to collect that material so that at least some of it is, accessible, but I would love to, know about that stuff. But I realized that if I was ever gonna get it's already taken me 15 years, if I were gonna get the book done, I had to stop somewhere. But that's a wonderful tale.
Her grandfather, or great-grandfather, was the second doctor in the town of Hinsdale. He became a doctor in like 1890. He was born in 1862, I believe, in Whiteside. And that's how we know we do genealogy.
Oh, okay.
And
That's
we
cool.
went there and did the research and found out a lot of this stuff.
Great.
And the town of Fulton is a huge Dutch.
Yes, I've spent time in Fulton, yeah. I also, in my historic road stuff, I was very involved with the Lincoln Highway and getting that all reestablished. And I know Fulton. Fulton's a real interesting place.
Yes, Barb Mast from the Historical Society. We showed her a cemetery which she didn't know existed.
Wow, terrific. Any other questions? Well, it's great to be with you, and maybe I'll be back in a couple of years and tell you the next cycle of stuff I've learned from people. We're hoping I'm working with editors right now, and we're hoping the book will be out this summer. And I'll certainly pass information on to Mike, and he can let you all know.
Might have a book signing.
Yeah?
Yes. And, we keep, we've been on about 10 years and he keeps telling me, oh yeah, the book, maybe next year.
There are a lot of people that treat me like this. It's just, but it's.
But he's working on a lot of books, so it's just, he has to, I guess, work on one and then you get.
That's right. It's all. It's fun.
Okay, very good. And next month, we'll have Cynthia Lorick here. And she's still working, she's another one that's still working on a book, but she's working on a book on English. And I haven't talked to her for a while, so I don't know what the progress is, but she's been working on it she was here in, I think, 2014, or, I think first year, yeah, 2014 to talk about it. And so we'll have her back for that. And then, maybe even as early as next year, we'll have Larry back talk about his bikers club.
Yeah, right. And if anybody would like to be, get tuned into this conversation about doing a little Calumet Freedom Show, please fill one of these out and give it to me.
Oh, is Secure, is that totally gone?
Yeah, Secure is totally gone. There have been about 4 efforts to do this little Calumet Underground Railroad stuff, and everyone has not worked, and we're hoping this one is going to work.
That sounds exciting.
I'm retired now, so this one will happen.
Okay. So, and no other announcements? So thank you all for coming.